Channel 3 Moscow is a production of KTCA TV, Channel 2, for stations of the Minnesota Public Television Network.
Hello, I'm Jan Smaby. Several months ago, one of the producers here at KTCA dragged me into his office and showed me a piece of videotape which has stuck with me ever since. It was a clip from Soviet television showing a classroom of well-scrubbed Soviet-grade school children struggling to learn a well-known American protest song. Ever since that moment, I have been fascinated by the bits and pieces of Soviet TV I have seen. Tonight, you'll have the chance to share the fascination as we glimpse a part of the Soviet Union the way the Soviet people see it, through television, in a program we call Channel 3 Moscow.
Most of us have a lot of stereotypes about life in the Soviet Union. In our mind's eye, the pictures are uniformly gray. Life in Moscow is, at best, highly organized, at worst, dull and depressing. Well, daily programming on Soviet television will confirm some of these stereotypes, but shatter others. For months now, producers here at KTCA have been reviewing hundreds of hours of Soviet domestic satellite broadcasts. This summer, we aired highlights from those broadcasts on our Friday night series, Almanac. This evening, we begin a series of specials devoted to highlights and analysis of Soviet programming. Tonight's show will examine programs aired in Moscow in September, including news, cultural programming, cartoons, and even a few commercials.
We've obviously had to do some editing, but we have tried hard to retain the feel of the original programs. The editing techniques and special effects you will see are theirs. The slight flicker and occasional glitch are ours, due to the difficult process needed to convert the Soviet television signal. We begin tonight where we will often begin, with highlights from the evening newscast Vremya, time in Russian. It probably goes without saying that news in the Soviet Union is a function of the state, and we start with a look at the way Vremya described last month's events within the Soviet borders. The narration is by Lori Kamen. The Russian translation is the work of Basil Ivanov.
Добрый вечер.
Здравствуйте, товарищи.
Vremya is not exactly the kind of newscast where you'd expect to see a lot of light, interesting features. In fact, most of the broadcasts we've seen this month seem to begin with either a dry agricultural or industrial story. This item from September 8th was made a little more interesting by the presence of Communist Party leader Mikhail Gorbachev, who's been more visible lately, presumably with the November summit drawing near. In this clip, Gorbachev is talking with the manager of a cooperative in Leningrad.
Will you fulfill your plan? We'll try. It's difficult. That's not an answer. We always try. Well, the weather. Comrades, I'm giving a speech tonight in which I will say that our weather in our country is set for the next 100 years. Rain or no rain, we need the harvest. Agreed. 20 years ago, it was less. I must say that I'm expecting much from Kazakhstan because there's quality grain for trade in Kazakhstan. Grain is an all-union problem here in Kazakhstan.
While agricultural stories are often seen on Vremya, rarely are any of the pitfalls of farming shown. While this story covers the extensive crop damage from a recent storm, it focuses on the almost heroic efforts made to salvage the crops, not on the damage itself.
This is what a Baltic storm did at harvest end. Century-old trees fell, took the roofs off grain silos, and then the rains fell, a total of a month's rainfall in 24 hours. Of course, all of this took its toll, but nevertheless, the grain was harvested in 10 days' time, threshed, and stored in government granaries. Again, the abilities of the workers was put to the test. They worked hard, they were versatile, mobile. Without waiting for orders, they made the most of every day. The people believed in the new job. They were convinced that whatever the weather, it wasn't going to stand in the way of harvesting the crop where agri-science is involved.
We've seen a number of consumer-oriented stories on Vremya this past month. However, none of these dealt with the vast shortages and long queues we often hear about. Quality was stressed in many of the reports seen on Soviet TV. This story about refrigerators, for example, describes in minute detail the great repair service available.
For the past 3 years on Krasnodarskaya Street, the Center for the Repair of Refrigerators, Biryusa, has been in operation. Every year it fills 70,000 repair orders. Every year there are more orders, but fewer people coming to the plant. This is the reason why. A refrigerator is not an iron. You can't carry it to the shop. You have to haul it, and not every model can fit into a taxi. To get it there and get it back will take more than a day. The center takes the majority of its orders by phone. If the dialed number is busy, the call is automatically switched to another line. You can call from 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. This job has no lunches or holidays. Here in the center, there is a large demonstration hall where even more economical refrigerators featuring colored plastic models of the Biryus. You can order a model color here that matches the color of the kitchen interior. Because the factory is so conscious of the quality of the product, they established this center.
No, this is not a fashion runway in New York or Paris. It's a commercial that appeared on Soviet TV this past month. But even more surprising was the commentary that followed, openly criticizing the shortages of quality goods in the Soviet Union.
Hello, comrades. Every time I watch a commercial, I get the thought, how many goods do we need to meet our demands? With all of this abundance we produce, these products ought to satisfy all of our needs. But the talk is that all of these products should be quality ones, the kinds we wait for in stores, the kind that fulfill our expectations and bring us joy. And at this point, the kinds of questions we endlessly discuss in the program. The deficit as a whole is shrinking. The number of unavailable goods is lessening. Nevertheless, we sense a deficit.
Shortages of any kind are rarely seen on Vremya. That's why this story about shortages of wallpaper took us somewhat by surprise.
This is the wallpaper store. Either the selection is very scarce, or as in this store, which is connected to the Moscow factory Dawn, one must wait an hour or more in line. The simple item has been product deficient for many years. And although the artists of the Moscow factory are always studying the needs of buyers, and they produce monthly 35 patterns already existing, nevertheless, there isn't enough wallpaper, and the quality does not satisfy the customers by a long shot. The factory is being refurbished. Our first goal for the refurbishing for 85-86 is to turn out 15 million pieces of wallpaper. But you must not forget that we have a second and third factory in the works. From the Hydrometric Center for September 15th, in regions of the Far East and Northeast Siberia, there will be freezing temperatures at night and light rain during the day.
Vremya's weather segments consist of a range of high temperatures for the day, offering minimal forecasts. That approach certainly minimizes the possibility of any errors.
In Kamchatka, +7 to +12 for the highs, lows to -4 tonight. In Magadan, 0 to 5 degrees above, -6 to -12 tonight. On the Okhotsk seaboard, +3 to +8, -9 tonight. Chukotka, -3 to 2 degrees above, -7 to 12 degrees below, with some snow.
Шахматное первенство между Анатолием Карповым и Гарри Каспаровым.
When Americans think of sports on television, we usually think of something like baseball or football. Well, the Soviets also devote significant airtime to sports like soccer, gymnastics, and chess.
The deciding factor in the game came after 56 moves, when the white attack became even stronger. Although the Black King was able to move successfully toward the center of the board from a dangerous situation, the white position was overwhelming.
Clearly, one of the biggest domestic stories during the month of September was this story about a Soviet space mission from September 19th. The Soviet mission control looks amazingly like its American counterpart.
The docking of Soyuz T-14 has fallen on the same day as the birthday of Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. Would you say that his predictions and hopes have come to pass? Of course they have, and they have come to pass exactly as Tsiolkovsky said. In terms of a city in space, with 3 ships linked, with a broad scope of scientific experiments, we have reached a new stage, and the predictions are coming true.
Even the lighthearted interview between the cosmonauts and the folks down in Mission Control could have been done here in the U.S. Incidentally, this is one of the rare lively moments we've seen on Vremya.
Хочется надеяться, что в лучшую сторону. Мы очень рады встрече.
We've brought the guys a few earthly delights. Here's a bouquet of flowers, an apple, mail, matryoshka, lemons. In all, it's a joy for us to meet here and present some presents from Earth. And the flowers. The flowers were the first priority. Where are the letters?
With us now is someone whose face is familiar to viewers who watched Almanac last summer. Nick Hayes is a professor of Soviet history and culture at Hamline University. Nick first became acquainted with Vremya when he was a visiting professor in Moscow. Nick, nice to have you back here.
It's nice to be back.
I see the astronauts or the cosmonauts are going to get matryoshka. What is matryoshka?
Well, matryoshka is the favorite folk, Russian folk doll, the wooden dolls that open up, and then there's another little one inside again. This is, you know, if the Americans can shoot golf balls on the moon, this is, the Soviets can pass around everyday gifts. It's kind of the trivialization of space. We both do this.
I noticed at the beginning that Gorbachev is visiting with the farmers, but he seems to be lecturing as well as politics.
You know, this actually surprised me a bit, because every fall the stock piece is what a wonderful harvest we have. It's usually accompanied by a few volunteers going out to pick a few potatoes and so on and so forth. But this was actually slightly bad news. It referred to water damage. And you're right, the tone was one of lecturing.
He asked them, didn't he, are you going to meet the plan?
Right. And the response, the director knew the correct response. He said, we're not going to blame it on the weather. We're not going to blame it on the weather anymore. And you know, since 1973, every year they've been blaming things on the weather. And what Gorbachev is saying, we know what the weather's like here. We know what it's going to be like for 100 years. And therefore you work. You get the plans done.
You know, one thing we noticed this past month was a number of consumer stories, and we wondered why. So on Monday of this week, we spoke with Meade Jorgensen, a reporter and photographer in the Moscow bureau of the Cable News Network.
Well, you can speculate that possibly with the new leader, Mr. Gorbachev, that these stories have, you know, has come down from on high. That these stories should appear more. More stories should be done on consumer goods. This kind of crackdown was seen a lot under Andropov as well, and it carried over to Chernenko too. I mean, we had the head of Moscow's fashionable, not fashionable, but highly best-stocked food store, Gastronome #1, was actually shot for selling too many of his goods to special customers and running a corrupt food store. A plant manager, I forget the town at the moment, but a plant manager who was head of a huge cosmetics manufacturing firm, and a whole other complex was just given a very severe sentence for, among other things, many other things, but taking kickbacks for covering up a scandal where charcoal or coal dust was actually being used for mascara in women's cosmetics. And you know, that crackdown on corruption started under Andropov, sort of continued apparently under Chernenko, and so this could be a continuation of that. It could be something new. It's hard to say.
Nick, what about this story about the appliance repairs are now available and you can even call up on the phone?
Oh, there's many levels. It's a wonderful story. I mean, in part I took it, I mean, this is the final answer to Richard Nixon's kitchen debates when Nixon talked about the wonders of American kitchen. And now we're seeing the wonders of Soviet refrigerators. One of the points is, the obvious point is that we have more, you used the phrase earlier about colors. We think of it as uniformly drab. Well, now we see a country of many colored refrigerators. But the real story there is this peculiar thing about service. And what's not being said is that the reality is it's very difficult to get appliance repaired. Normally in the Soviet Union, there's even a reference here that there's no closing for lunch or breaks, because usually you go there and things are closed. It's very difficult.
And they were open like till 9 p.m. or
right.
available.
And my hunch is one of the messages there is you don't have to go to the black market. You don't have to pay them overtime to get your refrigerator repaired. If you can get it in the taxi and get it down there, it's going to be repaired. And that's the message.
But it still doesn't mean they'll come out and fix it.
No, they didn't say that, but they will take telephone calls.
But Nick, let's talk a little bit more about the black market. For example, the piece about the shortages of wallpaper that they actually showed people waiting in line outside. And one reads in books as well as in the articles about how everyone has to queue up in line and wait endlessly to get even the most basic kinds of goods. That does make the black market pretty lucrative, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, it is true. You have to queue up for most major, especially quality goods. I wouldn't say basic goods, but what was interesting about that little spot, by the way, was the showing of a very unpleasant scene. People waiting outside a factory. That's not good copy. And it's roughly like getting your refrigerator fixed, of course. So the reality is that people don't have confidence that they can get diversified wallpaper. They probably know that it's being sold. There's a Russian expression for it, under the table, that they can get it through various other contacts. And this relates, and Jorgensen's quite correct, that there has been an increasing pressure. It really started even before Andropov, since 1979 on, to direct to the problem not just of shortages, but to the implication that there's some corruption and graft going on. We know about it. We're getting tough. The reference to the charcoal mascara. And we're dealing with the problem. There's a certain candor to Gorbachev's a discussion of these issues that was absent in the 70s.
Well, that kind of covers the domestic scene this month. Now I think we ought to look at what's going on internationally. Jan?
All right, Joe. As this week's hostage incident in Beirut makes clear, international events often have a direct bearing on the Soviet Union. And while many of us think of the Soviet Union as isolated, Soviet viewers see a surprising amount of international news. Vremya contains much more foreign news than its American counterparts. Here's a sampling of the international reports that aired in September on Soviet news.
From what we've seen, Vremya's coverage of international affairs seems to focus lots of attention on oppression and devastation in the West. But this past month, we also saw this fascinating report from the United States concerning the recent Time magazine cover story on Communist Party leader Mikhail Gorbachev.
Ответы товарища Горбачева американскому журналу Time.
The answers of Comrade Gorbachev to the American magazine Time were very timely, very much to the point. We must note that 9 out of 10 Americans support the summit of the leaders in an agreement with the Soviet Union. This is why it is not easy for the leadership of America to discard the idea of cooperation and to realize what you might call total aggressiveness. Here are the answers of Comrade Gorbachev to Time magazine and his discussion with the American journalists. In general, any illusions were swept aside. Moreover, this important document is being widely read and discussed. It was read in Time and in many newspapers, TV, and radio as well. Americans became acquainted with him, and their discussions are following the line of how to encourage cooperation. The words of Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev to Time magazine have taken wing, concerning the fact that our countries will either live together or will perish together. In Rome, proceedings began anew in the attempt on the head of the Roman Catholic Church, John Paul II.
On September 19th, we saw this story concerning the trial of Ali Aja, who was charged with the assassination attempt against Pope John Paul II.
In the previous court session, the total lack of substantiation of participation by Bulgarian citizens was shown. During the proceedings, it was clearly shown that Turkish terrorists were deeply involved. from the underground neo-fascist group Grey Wolves. The Democratic Society of Italy is demanding the swift identification of the true perpetrators and to remove the blame from innocent people, blame which was based on lies.
Традиционный праздник газеты французских коммунистов «Юманите».
This story from September 17th describes the growth of the French Communist Party during the traditional celebration of the French Communist newspaper Humanitaire.
To unite around the party as a widespread union for the future of the country is the message on the banner to the main entrance. These words are taken from the last convention of French communists. The unending flood of people during the days of the celebration for the party and the people of Courneuf is the graphic example of the working class responding to the call of the party. Claude Gradin and Evelyne Pinault have just joined the party. The French Communist Party is the only power in the country which defends the public interest. I am proud that I will be fighting in its ranks. The Communist Party's plan is the answer to my urgent needs. I have children. What will they become when they grow up? Unemployed? I joined the Communist Party to fight under its leadership, to solve the problems that are facing the country.
During the month of September, news from South Africa frequently appeared on Vremia. One story mentioned the U.S. and its so-called non-action policy as an obstacle toward ending apartheid in that country. This story from September 18th depicts the excessive violence apartheid has caused.
In South Africa, clashes of government enforcers and anti-racist demonstrators continues. In the streets of Soweto and other South African suburbs of industrial centers, increased numbers of troops and police patrol the areas. In Cape Town, the police dealt with demonstrators protesting the bloody repression of Pretoria.
The plight of American Indians was portrayed in this Vremia story from September 12th. It describes Leonard Peltier as an innocent victim of U.S. discrimination against certain ethnic groups.
The ruling circles of the USA are increasing the repression of the country's ethnic groups. 10 years of a human life, that is 10 years have crossed out of the life of Leonard Peltier for a crime he didn't commit, a life behind bars for the alleged killing of 2 FBI agents. The so-called action of Leonard Peltier has again brought to attention of the American and international community the lack of rights of Native Americans. Many in America feel that the situation is a national disgrace for the country that sees itself as an example of freedom and democracy. And the downward trend, where the American Indians once numbered 12 million and now only number 1 million, continues today. Hunger, poverty, serious illness are unavoidable elements of life on the reservation. 8 out of 10 people here are unemployed. Indians are mercilessly driven from their land. Even against this kind of injustice and unfairness, Leonard Peltier spoke out.
Mr. President, can it be what it seems? There will be no more children, no more love, no more dreams.
The theme of children, even American children as ambassadors of peace, is by now standard Soviet TV fare, as we see in this clip from September 10th.
A fund has been created in the name of Samantha Smith by one of the citizen exchange groups of the U.S., Friendship Force. They've decided to immortalize the memory of the American schoolgirl who fervently strived for peace and friendship between the people of the Soviet Union and the United States. The fund will provide annually a 2-week trip to the Soviet Union for an American boy or girl, aged 11 to 14, who will be the winners of a contest demonstrating their friendship and goodwill, their sincere quest for peace, the excellent ideals and convictions which were exhibited by Samantha Smith.
Nick, in the piece on the Time magazine coverage, the story of Gorbachev, the reporter described Time magazine as an important document. Now, how many of the citizens in the Soviet Union have read Time magazine?
Well, actually read it very few. I suspect it's something you can see occasionally in Moscow and Leningrad and Kiev. They circulate. I doubt if the average Soviet can distinguish between Time, Newsweek. They probably tend to see all of the major American publications lumped in as one, as we tend to see all the Soviet publications as if it's, you know, one voice. What I kept wondering, what would Henry Luce say about this? I mean, here's Time magazine being touted by the Soviets. I mean, why? You know, we saw them before when we watched Soviet television, trying to disparage Newsweek, frequently trying to undermine the credibility of the American press. In a way, it was a betrayal of how much credibility it has. And now, of course, Gorbachev is credible. Why? He's the cover story of Time magazine.
Speaking of credibility, you'll remember this summer they ran a significantly long segment on Muhammad Ali Agha, the guy who tried to shoot the Pope, and now they're doing it again. Why is that such big news in the Soviet Union?
Well, it must be that rumors are out, probably via the BBC, that there's rumors of a Bulgarian connection, which means, of course, a Soviet connection as well. And that it's trying to preempt that rumor. And how do you preempt it? You preempt it by showing this Turkish assassin on TV.
Blame the Turks.
And the Russians are not...
Turkish right-wing extremist group.
The Russians are not known for being Turkophiles either. So you just listen to his testimony.
At least not for the past 1,500 years or so.
Right.
What about the piece on Leonard Peltier here in the United States? That is something that is fairly frequently shown in terms of oppressed minorities in this country being given quite a bit of attention on Soviet television, correct?
Yeah, that is a set standard piece. I mean, we are the country of racism, unemployment, pornography, drugs, and violence. And of course, what struck me about as interesting about the piece is it doesn't really have any contemporary any note. There was no event that precipitated the piece. It was just
news page.
Right. It was just time to discuss Native American problems. But again, they are most credible when they treat a very serious American problem. That could have come from an American journalist. The sources, the quotes, there was really, no Soviet embellishment to it. It was a straight story.
Now, they've treated that American problem, but they're starting to treat a Soviet Union problem. And we again had some comments from our reporter with cable news. During this past week, it was interesting to see that there have been a number of stories on Soviet television, actually over the past several months, regarding the war in Afghanistan. We asked Mee Jorgensen about this increase in coverage and what this increase in coverage means.
I don't think it means the war is drawing to a close. What I do think it means, in fact, is that the Soviet television and news media might be preparing the Soviet people for a long haul. What we have seen recently on television is a reporter who is riding in amongst the troops, whether they be Afghan or Soviet, and actually some little bits of fighting. I know over the weekend, in fact, there were some pictures of an Afghan patrol actually looking like they were doing some genuine fighting, and an interview with the Afghan commander. A couple of days before that, there was an interview with a Soviet soldier who is a mine expert. He defuses mines, and he was saying how dangerous a job it is, and they have to defuse mines in houses and buildings, and they talked about a monument to dead Soviet soldiers in Afghanistan. And I think if anything, as I say, they're preparing Soviet people for the fact that there is a war there.
But clearly, Nick, while they may be attempting to prepare the Soviet people for the war that's going on, and it may be a long run, Afghanistan hasn't been brought into the homes of the Soviet Union citizens the way Vietnam was brought into our homes.
No, absolutely not. You see, I mean, they've learned a lesson from perhaps American TV in the Vietnam War. That is, just simply the presence of war on TV creates negative reactions in the population. So what you get is really kind of a very patriotic of our boys are out there, the people love them, they're doing their job. But I think the point is fairly correct that it's not by coincidence that suddenly it plays on the news again. And again, it's probably in reference to the rumor the boys are coming home in a box and that there are some problems that have to be addressed.
Is it unusual, by the way, to see the children, the United States and Soviet Union children, singing together about peace and also exhorting the President of the United States to be peaceful?
I don't know about the ages of the children. It's not unusual to see some international Congress of youth, one of which was just held recently with various songs of international fraternity and brotherhood. And of course, the key there is it's a song to Mr. President.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Mr. President is not identified, but obviously it only directs towards one country who's not listening to the world's children.
Nick, we're going to move now into another area, which is going to be cultural affairs. Joe?
On to culture. So far tonight, we've been talking about Soviet newscasts, both domestic and international. But there's much more to Soviet television than what appears on Vremya. There are children's shows, movies, variety programs, sports coverage, even Soviet-style commercials. In our next report, we're going to introduce you to some of this cultural programming. This report, again, is narrated by Laurie Kamen and translated by Basil Ivanov.
Физика и техника.
We've seen a number of Soviet television shows this past month geared toward children. The programs resemble early educational television here in the U.S. This program from September 5th points out the important role between physics and technology at a recent science fair.
We started this model in our club about a year and a half ago. It gathers debris in space. For in the cosmos there are rocket parts and other unneeded objects. This model draws these parts into the opening from which a gathering mechanism comes out. It grabs the rocket piece and draws it into the ship. The hatch closes, and then the debris is sent back to Earth. Of course, without physics, this kind of project would not be possible, because everything had to be calculated, the working of the arm, its length, the size of the motor, the transformers. Even though this model may not have a practical use, in time, in the future, it may become very useful.
После Меркурия следует планета Венера. Это самая близкая к Земле планета.
This program from September 18th about the solar system seems to be aimed at very young children, since it describes some fairly basic concepts.
Как восходит солнце. Мы с вами хорошо знаем.
And now we see how the sun rises. We know that the sun rises every morning in the east and sets every night in the west. We see the sun shine all day above our heads. We've gotten used to it, to its light, to its warmth.
На его поверхности температура около 6000 градусов.
I want to tell you kids, it is a huge, fiery, gaseous ball. The sun's outer surface is about 6,000 degrees, and the inner layers are considerably hotter. The sun radiates huge amounts of light and heat in all directions. But the Earth only receives 1/2 billionth part of its energy.
American parents apparently aren't the only ones concerned that their kids will be well equipped when they go back to school. As these next two reports indicate, Soviet parents want their children to have everything they need to get the new school year off to a good start.
School tomorrow. These clothes were bought in one of the Children's World stores, the final buys before the school year. The uniform section is especially interesting, where mothers and fathers see their children's uniform in front of their eyes when the kids put on their school dresses and jackets. What do the parents think of all of this? Well, children are children. They're always interesting. They're always unique in their own way. Today's kids are more mature, smarter, they can read, write, and count. In order for the maintenance of the health of younger students, there is a recommendation for the children to carry their books and notebooks in these kind of book bags. During this particular shooting, there was a plentiful number of all kinds of supplies for the parents to choose from, desks and book bags for every taste. We saw that the parents of young school-age children were taking the recommendations of teachers and doctors and buying their children proper school supplies, which their sons or daughters will use to do their homework. Do you like this desk? Yes. Shall we buy it? Yes.
Not surprisingly, from the looks of this Soviet cartoon, Soviet children would rather be outside playing with their friends than inside studying for exams. Since we first began viewing Soviet TV, we've seen a wide variety of entertainment shows, from operatic performance to aerobic dance. Surprisingly, we've also seen quite a few rock-type performers. We thought this group would have been perfect on the old Ed Sullivan Show.
The words of the song are, "People in time have partings and meetings, but he who believes and loves gets an answer. It is a great miracle. It goes on forever. To he who believes and loves we answer. Only love is always right. It's young like the grass in the spring. All passes, but love never ends. I don't understand what it is. I don't understand what it is that's going on with me. Again and again, I hope and I wait that someone will tell me I love you. A great word, it's always fresh. I always love it."
Убежал. Испугался тебя.
А почему?
Почему? Потому у тебя зубы выросли.
We've seen this storybook hour regularly on Soviet TV. This clip from September 19th appears to present a dog facing a moral dilemma, to bite or not to bite.
Что? Накусал? Я не кусаю.
I'm not biting. I'm building a dam. Don't bother me.
Здравствуй, кабанчик. У тебя такие большие зубы.
His job is to bite. You have such big teeth. Because I love acorns. To bite, is it good or bad? I don't know. Biting is bad. Why is it bad? Maybe you can. You need to sometimes when you're picked on.
We've seen a lot of foreign language shows on Soviet TV, especially Spanish. This show seems to borrow heavily from programs like Sesame Street in teaching basic language skills to children.
Atención.
Children's sports programs are often seen on Soviet TV. This show, from September 19th, sees young gymnast lives through the eyes of their coach.
I've noticed for a long time athletes are stubborn people, but they're just like children, and the trainer their mother and father. Work is not for the heavy. You have no peace day or night. The trainer has a heavy load, and life, in short, is very hard. The exercise is endless, and your nerves are wound tight. It's his responsibility. He has to find the right person.
Finally this month, we ran across this segment. Frankly, we're not exactly sure of its significance, but it was one of the few examples we saw of Soviet TV showing kids acting like kids.
Ну что, все готовы? Начали! Все хочется самим узнать и на себе пробовать. И то, что круглая земля, проверить самому. Но рядом ходят взрослые, они все знают лучше, что можно и чего нельзя. Они твердят с утра. Ньютон, не играйте с яблоком. Колумб, не делай кораблики. Коперник, опять ты вертишься. Не смей, не шуми, не трожь. Галилей, не спорьте с учителем. Диоген, вылезай из-под парты. У тебя такие родители, а ты на кого похож?
Nick, what significance do you attach to that Bugsy Malone piece at the end?
Well, actually, I took it as a comment on the earlier kind of saccharine discussion of the solar system, where you had the official Soviet figure talking in this almost baby talk, down-talking to the Soviet children. And here, this, by be more precisely, is a fragment from a Soviet children's film. And it's, if you look, it's much more spontaneous as to the way the kids really behave and having a good time. And it's a reference to kind of a mock of a rock group. A little more spontaneity than you see in the other children's
Something
programs.
that really stuck in my mind in terms of the way the Russians hit us for racism was the portrait of what certainly looked like Little Black Sambo in that children's film. Do you see that sort of tastelessness very often?
You know, we may be hypersensitive to this, but yes, I mean, it struck me as being almost a Little Black Sambo caricature. And this is surprising, if we watch every other piece of Soviet television, how sensitive and sophisticated they are to playing on racial issues in imagery. And a second element, regardless of whatever overtones one might want to read into it, is their animation is very good. Their cartoon work is normally exceptionally well done and very entertaining. I don't know what to make of that particular skit other than it was supposed to be set in a jungle.
Joining us now is someone whose journalistic credentials with regards to the Soviet Union are unquestioned, but whose roots are here in Minnesota. He's Harrison Salisbury, former Moscow bureau chief for the New York Times. He spent much of his time in recent years writing about the Soviet Union and another great country he came to know, China. Harrison Salisbury, welcome and thanks for being with us tonight.
Great to be here.
You lived in the Soviet Union when?
Well, my longest period was in the last of the Stalin years and then the first of the Khrushchev years. Of course, I've been back again and again since that time.
Now, what differences do you notice in the way Russian life is painted on our television clips tonight and what you remember from being face-to-face with it?
Well, just take two consumer items. Number one, we saw a queue for wallpaper in Moscow. There wasn't any wallpaper when I was there.
That sure solved the problem of waiting in line.
No problem there at all. Secondly, they had a service for refrigerators. You could get your electric refrigerator repaired. If you put it in a taxi, if it would fit in a taxi and took it down to the shop, they were there on duty all the time. Well, there were no refrigerators either. And the few people who had them certainly got them by black market methods, and they had them repaired by black market methods. And I would say, from what I know of Moscow, and I know a good deal of present-day Moscow, that most people still get their utilities repaired in the black market. It's faster. In fact, it's not only utilities, you get everything repaired in the black market, otherwise it probably doesn't get repaired.
How can the earnings from this be concealed in a society that supposedly is so state-controlled as Russia?
Well,
How can you make a lot of money on the black market and not
the
get
earnings
caught?
are money. More often than not, it's an exchange of services in kind.
Well, it can well be. I remember when I was there, I had a dacha, rented a dacha, country cottage just outside of Moscow. The only way you could get any repairs made to that was to hire the local carpenter who worked for a factory there, and he stole the lumber and the materials and stuff like that and made the additions or repaired in his spare time. He did that for everybody in the colony. You paid him some cash, but mostly vodka, and he got rid of that vodka very effectively.
Liquid assets, you
yes.
might say.
What about all the stories about children? Is that something that they've picked up based on the success of Sesame Street and really all the programs directed to children? Is Sesame Street
TV programs, in fact, Soviet literature, fairy stories and children's books have always been high class, and many of them have been translated into other languages and published in the West, and their sort of Sesame Street type things are sold in the international TV circuits, and some of them are shown over here, gussied up with different titles and, of course, with English language and all the rest of it, and you don't even know that they have a Soviet origin unless you look very closely at the small print.
One of my favorite pieces in this last segment was, I think they called it Storybook, the little stuffed animals and the little puppy dog, which really was so endearing. But it was noted that there was a moral being told here. Is that frequent in terms of children's shows, that there is always a moral message?
Not always a moral. I mean, like, you know, fairy stories always have a moral. The children's stories usually do have a moral of some kind. The Russians may rub it in a little bit more than we would, so they have those. The question about the little black Sambo, though, this is not unusual, I think, in the Soviet Union. While they're very careful in their attitude on race and color and things of that kind, they have many of these stereotype images which seem not to fit into the pattern, and they go on having the little black Sambos. At the same time, they may denounce the United States for not having race equality or something of that kind. Of course, they don't have race equality in their own country. I mean, there's the attitude of great Russians, the great Russian Slavs, toward the other ethnic peoples, particularly those of the East and the ones who are slightly colored, is very chauvinistic.
What signs of this did you see in everyday life?
Well, I've often seen it. I've seen it in very personal terms. I well remember a young woman whom I knew because she worked for one of the news agencies, and she was very much stricken by a cameraman, a news cameraman who was an Uzbek, came from Central Asia. And her girlfriends used to make very racial remarks about the very idea of her contemplating marriage, as she was, with this Uzbek. It was a very simple thing. They just didn't, they were all very chauvinistic Russian ladies, and they wouldn't think of marrying somebody of a different color, a different race. You get that kind of thing all the time. I've seen old ladies, old elevator ladies in the days when they had them at the Metropole Hotel. When a Chinese group would walk out of the elevator, they would spit after the Chinese because they were yellow people. They were Genghis Khan. I mean, it all mixed up in their minds that these were the people who'd come, Mongols who destroyed Russia, you know, nearly 1,000 years ago.
In the recent Time magazine article on Gorbachev, there was reference made to the fact that Gorbachev has slipped a couple of times and referred to the Soviet Union people as Russians. And then that has been allowed to go on air unedited, though he would quickly say, well, I mean, the people of the Soviet Union, we are that, we always will be that. But is this partly what you're referring to?
This is a very sensitive point, and it's very common. Stalin himself, when he was congratulating the people of the Soviet Union for their victory in the war, raised a toast to the great Russian people, and he meant that. He was not making a mistake. He was talking about the great Russian people because they were the most patriotic people. And it's not at all unusual for a Gorbachev or somebody like that to say Russian, although they try to correct themselves because there shouldn't be the Russians shouldn't be more superior, more equal than all the other peoples in the Soviet Union, but they are, of course. And so it's a very common and interesting kind of error for him to make.
Now, I suspect there's something else we'll never see on Soviet TV, and that will be the inter-party political fighting that really does go on there. But I have a sense that as Americans, we are very naive about that. We see the political party of Russia as a very monolithic organization, institution. It really isn't, is it?
It's because the fighting all goes on inside the party. It's something called democratic centralism, which was invented by Lenin, which the theory was that you could argue within the party, really outside of the sight of the public. You could choose up sides and fight all you wanted, but once the decision was made, you were all united behind that decision. It never, of course, is true. There always are two bodies or maybe more bodies of opinion within the party, and they can have terrific fights, and sometimes they're divided over leadership and as well as principles and things of that kind.
Something that's always interested me is how do these splits of opinion develop in a society where all the usual news media are state-controlled? How does the word get out in Kazakhstan that there is an argument in Siberia about policy in Belarus?
Well, let me first tell you the oldest joke in Moscow, which revolves around their two newspapers, Pravda, which means truth, and Izvestia, which means news. And ever since the day of Lenin, people have said, there is no news in Izvestia, and there is no truth in Pravda. So that gives you some sense of the attitude of people toward their newspapers. Then secondly, any intelligent Russian, wherever he is, learns from the age of the kindergarten to read between the lines, and the most important things are what are not said in the papers, and that's what I mean, if a name is omitted, he immediately knows there's a political significance to it. And in any society, like the Soviet society, where there is intense censorship and an effort to control the news, word of mouth spreads like lightning. And this is particularly true since even under Stalin, when you could have your head chopped off for repeating a rumor, that's not true now. And everybody knows what's going on top of which, today, with the ease of listening to foreign radio, and even though they jam VOA in Russian, everybody I know in Moscow listens every day, or somebody listens to the radio, the foreign radio, maybe BBC or the German radio, or the Japanese or the French, and they know what's happening in the world. And if our reporters from Moscow say, well, there's a power struggle going on between Ivanov and Popov, they hear it on the radio, and then they know it, even if they haven't heard of it before. Even if
Well, because Nick mentioned earlier this summer when we did some of these segments that shortwave radios are fairly easy to buy in the Soviet Union,
yes,
which
you
I
can get
didn't
them
know.
now, yeah.
Why do they allow that?
The real question isn't why do they allow that, but why are they so goddamn stupid, if you pardon the expression, not to put the news on their own radio when everybody in the country is getting it from someplace else? It's idiocy. If they could shut the thing off and nobody could hear anything, I could understand it. But they sell the radios, everybody listens to them, and then you pick up Pravda, and there's nothing about it in the paper. It doesn't make any sense at all.
Nick, what did you find when you were there on the visit? Did they know a lot about what was going on in terms of what was reported on foreign broadcasts?
I found that the BBC was the most common source of international information and the most frequent point of reference to begin the conversation about Iran or some event. Much more so than the American broadcast. But yes, at least certainly in the cities, in the city of Moscow, it's, as Harrison says, I mean, everybody watches it. Perhaps one of the reasons my response is, well, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the 30s and 40s there was a big part of the educational system in the Soviet Union was everybody should know how to construct their own radio. They used to have home study courses in constructing the radio, so this is kind of one of the inadvertent results of an educational policy. Everyone has shortwave radios.
Now, I was asking both of you before the show, I will confess, about something, and you had slight disagreements on that. And again, I'm pulling from the Time article. But there was Gorbachev calling on God, mentioning God, as he was exhorting all Soviet Americans, but really Americans, to work for peace. And he said, surely God on high has not refused to give us enough wisdom to find ways to bring, etc. I thought, my goodness, I don't remember a former Soviet party leader ever invoking the name of God. Now, you both have somewhat different opinions on this. Nick?
Well, my opinion is that, well, first of all, it is part of the proverbial speech, and Khrushchev did it frequently. He would slip and say some reference to God, maybe in a sentence, God will do this or that to us. But my feeling is that Gorbachev can write it off as that, a slip of speech, as part of the natural Russian idiom to use that. But that interview and everything he has done with the media, even your earlier references to the use of Russian, it strikes me as having far greater sophistication and deliberateness about everything he did. And that Time article was very finely tuned to American public opinion. I suspect it wasn't a slip of tongue. It was a deliberate play on American sympathies.
And you think it was more?
I didn't think it was a slip of the tongue. I thought it was perfectly natural expression. I've heard it so many times. The Russians use it all the time, and political leaders use it as well. I've heard them use it for domestic audiences as well as Khrushchev used it all the time in foreign connections. So it seemed to me a perfectly natural thing for him to say. And Gorbachev is a very free-flowing politician. It's true he knows what he's doing, but he's not a person who has to use a script.
Now, Harrison Salisbury, we have only seconds left. How do you think the upcoming Geneva summit will be played on Soviet television?
Oh, I think you'll get a very strong play of it, and it'll be backing up Gorbachev. Gorbachev is going to be I rather expect Gorbachev to be a very, very effective man at Geneva. Maybe not with the American press and the American public, but so far as the rest of the world is concerned, and he'll get a strong backup from the Soviet press.
Thank you, Harrison Salisbury, very, very much.
Thanks a lot for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
Tonight's show has frankly been an experiment. We are now planning a second edition of Channel 3 Moscow for the evening of Wednesday, November 6th. But before then, we are very interested in your thoughts about what you saw tonight. So please, call us tonight with your comments about Soviet television. Call if you have questions, call if you have concerns. Call us and tell us what's on your mind. The number to dial is 612-642-1980. It's an answering machine, and the lines may be busy, so you should jot the number down. The number again is 612-642-1980. You can call anytime. We would also like to thank Father Lee Lubers and Rick Marchio of the Telecommunications Department at Creighton University. They are the people who supplied us with the hundreds of hours of Soviet TV we looked at for this show. That's it for tonight. Please join us Friday at 7 for Almanac, and be with us again November 6 for another edition of Channel 3 Moscow. Until then, for Joe Summers, I'm Jan Smaby. Good night.
Channel 3 Moscow is a production of KTCA-TV Channel 2 for stations of the Minnesota Public Television Network.